Walt Disney Company CEO Bob Iger earlier this week at an investor conference said that he wanted to, quote, quiet the noise in the culture wars. Culture wars that he and his minions at the Walt Disney Company started while former CEO Bob Chapek was still there. But there was a lot more to the conference than just that one-line quote. In fact, there was a lot that Bob Iger said that gave Wall Street some concern, and there was a lot that Bob Iger didn't say that gave them even more. That information came in the form of an analyst report from CFA Laura Martin over at Needham. And as it just so happens, we have the full copy of her report. And we're going to cover it today. Stay tuned. Here we go. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. There is a lot more information in this report than just the quiet the noise remark that everybody's discussing. But before we get to that, let's actually cover that comment from Bob Iger. After Disney's recent failures in federal and state courts, there's little other interpretation that anybody can make to this than Bob Iger waving the white flag of surrender. If you recall, recently, the state case was not going in their favor. Disney filed a motion to dismiss. The judge said no. They went to federal court and then basically amended the entire lawsuit that they had filed against the state of Florida, the Central Florida Tourism Oversight Board, and even Governor Ron DeSantis himself. They amended it just down to nothing more than a free speech violation claim, which of course is bogus, and we've covered it over and over again here on this channel why. But if you need a reminder, it's very simple. The former Reedy Creek Improvement District is not part of the Walt Disney Company. It's not owned by the Walt Disney Company. No private company has a right to own its own private government, no matter where it is. And there's no right to have the abuse powers that Disney had over that government. That federal case is going to go nowhere for the Walt Disney Company, and Bob Iger is finally coming to the realization of that. He's also probably realized the damage that this has done to Disney itself from a business perspective, and they need to get out of it. Although they want to save face and they can't just drop the lawsuits altogether. But rest assured, the discussion about those lawsuits, at least in public by Bob Iger, is probably going to dwindle to not even a whisper. Just as folks like myself, Legal Mindset, and WDW Pro have been telling you for a year and a half since all of this mess with Disney started, this was never going to go in Disney's favor. And that has not changed one bit. I know that the pixie dust is very strong out there with a lot of folks, and that's fine. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the law is the law, and the law is going to prevail. What's funny about quieting the noise with this culture war that Bob Iger seems to want to do now is that he's the one who started it in the first place, not Bob Chapek. If you remember our coverage from the get-go, it was Bob Chapek who was trying to quiet the noise in the beginning. Ergo, he was trying to keep Disney out of the political fight in Florida. He thought Disney had no place in it, but he was forced into a corner by Bob Iger himself, and more specifically, the stooges that Bob Iger left behind at Disney to undermine Bob Chapek every step of the way. It could very easily be argued that this entire Florida mess was largely set up by Bob Iger to get rid of Bob Chapek, something now that seems even more realistic thanks to recent reporting from CNBC and Alex Sherman that we covered a few weeks ago. Now, this investor conference was right after Bob Iger and the Walt Disney Company filed with the SEC, something that we covered a couple of days ago, talking about how they plan to spend $60 billion in CapEx, or capital expenditures, over the next 10 years on theme parks. And this is what gave a lot of analysts some dire concerns, and this report details those concerns. From Needham, Disney held a 120-person investor event at Walt Disney World, which it did not webcast. Our key takeaways at Needham were the following. CEO Iger will, quote, quiet the noise. Content should be entertaining, not issues focused. Lower output by Marvel Studios and lower the cost per unit, and Pixar to focus on sequels, not new stories. Whoa, that's a mouthful right out of the gate. Quieting the noise, Iger talking about wanting to go back to entertainment focus as opposed to issue-focused content production. Can't say I'm seeing a whole lot of change here, at least not for the next year or two. Things that have been greenlit 2, 3, 4 years ago are the stuff that we're seeing coming out on Disney Plus and in theaters today. So it's going to be some time before we see any major change, and that's if there is actually going to be any major change. And probably if you asked your magic 8-ball, it would tell you doubtful. But the real kick in the pants here is Bob Iger telling the analysts that he's going to lower the output by Marvel Studios and lower the cost per unit. Now, exactly what Iger meant by that, we can't be certain, but we certainly could speculate based on where Disney is spending its capital, and that is largely for Marvel right now on Disney Plus. The yields for those shows, of course, are zero. Disney Plus is losing money each and every quarter, so it's very difficult to attribute any type of positive revenue from these shows. They don't seem to be driving subscriber growth, as in the last 2 fiscal quarters, Disney has lost over 500,000 subs in North America alone. Sure, a lot of folks out there like to talk about Disney losing tens of millions of subs, and that is accurate. But the Disney Plus subscribers that have left in those ranges have overwhelmingly come from places like India, where Disney Hotstar lost the rights to stream the IPL Cricket League. So lowering the output from Marvel is probably largely going to come in the way of scaling back on the number of productions that they make for Disney Plus television shows, and then, of course, for the ones that they do still make, cutting the budgets back. We have covered ad nauseum here on Valiant Renegade the radical overspending by the Walt Disney Company on, frankly, very mediocre product. Things that most people just don't seem to be watching or getting that excited by. Netflix, on the other hand, is turning out tons of excitement with similar productions or lower cost productions. Things like One Piece recently, which we've been talking about a lot. When you compare One Piece to Ahsoka and you look at the excitement for that show versus the latest Star Wars show, there is a huge divide between the two. And don't forget, we recently covered how much money Disney spent to make Infinity War and Endgame back in 2018 and 2019. Those production costs tallied up for those 2 movies at over $1 billion. And then there's Pixar that was thrown into the mix, focusing on sequels and not new stories. See, again, this is one of these issues where Disney doesn't feel it has the chutzpah inside of Disney to actually produce quality new content that's going to drag people in. They have to go back to old IPs, things like Toy Story, or in the case of Disney Animation, Frozen. Bring back sequels to those. Why? Because, well, it doesn't matter in their mind how well or poorly these stories might be composed. It's just a matter of, here's the IP that you know. Go watch it. Go spend money. Look at the largesse of Disney's content production these days. They don't seem terribly concerned with quality of final product. They seem more concerned about simply leveraging the IP because they think that's what's going to get the biggest return on investment. Like I've said before, I think the funniest statement that Disney has made in the last few years have been, "We're great storytellers." No, you're not anymore. That's the problem. Now, the next section asks the question about what is the future of ESPN direct-to-consumer. Not the ESPN Plus system they have now that shows second and third tier broadcast games, the ones that don't rise to the occasion of being on the traditional linear broadcast ESPN. But what is going to go on down the road, because that has been a big revenue driver for Disney for decades, ever since they bought them when they acquired ABC nearly 30 years ago. Iger had recently talked about bringing in a partner for distribution, and it looks like that may be Amazon. Again, we covered this in a video a few weeks ago, and the Amazon partnership makes a whole lot of sense in this regard. But no word yet as to whether or not that partnership will actually materialize or when it would. But of course, the $60 billion announcement in new CapEx for the parks was the big headline of this meeting. And they're talking about this over the next 10 years. That's double what they spent in the previous 10 years. And credit to Needham Investments and chartered financial analyst Laura Martin, who picked up on the fact that this may not be all it's cracked up to be, something that I was personally concerned about myself. But before we go there, let's look at the next section that Laura discloses in her investment report. Key topics not discussed: Hulu, the Hollywood strikes, linear TV's decline, that is ABC, FX, Nat Geo, all the things we've heard discussed about they're being put up for sale. The Disney film weakness, meaning the weakness of the films that Disney is releasing into theaters, which we have covered here quite frequently and laughed at quite a bit. No update on a permanent replacement at the chief financial officer position, of course, since Christine McCarthy flew out the door earlier this year. Then, of course, there's the risks in China, which have always been there, but it's now heightened because Disney is committing to spend $60 billion in cap just to enhance, mostly from what it seems like, international parks, Shanghai Disney being among them. But then, in the investment conclusions, there was a very, frankly, terrifying statement made. Since the launch of Disney Plus in 2019, Disney's primary revenue growth driver has been streaming. Again, not revenue driver, folks, but revenue growth driver. This is a downrange perception. This means that analysts expected, not in the immediate term, but in the long term, for DTC or direct-to-consumer to be the next big revenue driver for the Walt Disney Company as years went on. This week's Orlando investor event implies a material capital allocation pivot towards parks, cruise ships, hotels, and timeshares, and other physical assets as its core growth drivers for the next decade. This capital allocation pivot makes us at Needham wonder, does Disney no longer think of streaming as a key growth driver? I cannot express how big of a holy crap moment this is for Wall Street, because if others out there share the same sentiment as Laura Martin's interpretation of this investor conference, and I promise you, many of them probably do, then Wall Street is scratching their heads right now wondering, what did we get all excited about back in 2019? We thought Disney was going to become a streaming giant. Now, certainly by nature of subscribers alone, they're right in there with people like Netflix, but the positive operating income, the profits, in other words, have yet to materialize. And Disney has less than a year at this point to reach their goal of profitability by the end of fiscal 2024. And Laura Martin from Needham Investments seems to clearly point out the fact that this conference did not give her, and perhaps a lot of other Wall Street analysts, any confidence that this is forthcoming. The simple question they're all asking themselves right now is this: if Disney is so confident in the future of streaming for its company, why then did they just announce $60 billion in CapEx over the next 10 years that didn't even mention streaming at all? Laura Martin and Needham go on to ask the following question of Disney: why invest in parks now instead of 5 years ago, pre-COVID? We at Needham worry that the strong margins and return on invested capital, that's what ROIC means, folks, at parks today are related to a cyclical rebound from the forced COVID park closures in 2020 and 2021. And therefore, $60 billion of CapEx decisions are being made based on unsustainable and elevated profit margins. So let me translate. Wall Street analysts are concerned that Disney is basing this entire $60 billion CapEx commitment into parks, and frankly, not even parks, mostly timeshares, resorts, hotels, and cruise ships, based on this massive rebound from the COVID lockdowns a few years ago. In the report, Disney bragged about having the best year-over-year returns, the highest per capita guest spending at parks and hotels. And certainly while inflation pressures and macroeconomic pressures have played a factor into those things, the Disney seems to be ignoring the fact, given the level of commitment they're making with $60 billion in the next 10 years, that a lot of that was also due to pent-up frustration of people being forced to stay home. Wall Street clearly doesn't seem to think that the level of growth and attendance and spending that guests have made in Disney parks that the Walt Disney Company has been bragging about these past 12 months is sustainable in the long term. Furthermore, the report goes on to say that they think the $60 billion in CapEx for the physical property, the real property of parks and resorts, is lower yielding and far riskier than those investing in the digital realm, at least for the long term. A few other revelations from the conference was this regarding the box office weakness that we talked about earlier. Iger addressed the question by saying, Marvel made too many TV series and films, and they will cut back releases and average budget. Pixar directors are mostly new, so he feels Disney is better off assigning them existing characters and stories through sequels rather than starting from scratch like Elemental or Turning Red. Oh, great. Hand very popular money machine Pixar IPs to new lackeys that don't know their butt from a hole in the ground. I'm sure that'll turn out wonderfully, just like all the Disney remakes and sequels and adaptations of the last 2 or 3 years. Elemental had a production budget of $200 million, another marketing budget of $100 million. Total box office was $484 million, plus strong streaming views. So it just goes to show right there, exactly as we told you, yes, while Elemental performed better than we anticipated when it initially released, it still lost money in the theaters, no doubt. A $300 million total spend by the Walt Disney Company is not going to be covered by $484 million at retail box office. They needed at least $600 million to make back their nut on what they spent. Turning Red, a $175 million budget from Pixar, $75 million still spent in marketing, and that movie went straight to Disney Plus. And at 4 years was the fastest production for a Pixar film. In other words, Turning Red is $250 million that Disney will never see again. Now, there's quite a bit more in this report, especially about ESPN and other aspects, cruise ships and whatnot for the Walt Disney Company, but too much to go through all in one video. But please make sure you join us Sunday afternoon at 6 p.m. Eastern for the Valiant Renegade Online live show, where we will be going through this report in much grander detail. We hope to see you there. Make sure before you check out, you hit that like and subscribe button, and do leave your comments and thoughts below the video. Want to hear from you. Try to respond to as many as possible. But until Sunday on the live show, take care.